What I thought I would look at today is looking at the use of indicators in the fight against poverty. And I would like to start by thanking the Centre for inviting me, for sure. It was a wonderful year that I spent here with the Centre. I see some faces that I know, and je m'ennuie. As Sonia mentioned, I work in Quebec. So on the other side of that cement wall, that's the Ottawa River. That's where I work. I'm an anti-poverty activist, and since 2002 in Quebec, we have a law to combat poverty and social exclusion. It was voted in 2002, and today we're 2012, so that's 10 years that we've had this law. And normally after 10 years, you should start to be able to see whether the law had some effects, right? So the Quebec government has effectively begun to draw its own conclusions. And I have this little PowerPoint. This is the conclusions of the Quebec government. Now, I don't know you in the room, but most of you probably have done high school French, right, in your time. So you understand that the Quebec progresse, that means Quebec is making progress. The way that the Quebec government is able to say that its strategy to fight poverty is making progress is because Quebec has adopted an indicator approach to fighting poverty. And right now, the indicators are telling the government that the fight that they're waging is successful. So that's kind of what I'd like to look at over the next 20 minutes. My starting point is that poverty is fundamentally a violation of the human rights of the poor. To be poor means to have substandard housing, means often to have bad teeth, means to have an empty fridge, or it means that you have no money to send your kid to a friend's birthday party. Often, poverty is a history or a cycle of a whole bunch of these violations, multiple violations. And when you're poor, your rights violations are such that you're not able to live as fully human. That's my starting point when I look at poverty. And what I think we will see in the presentation, what I hope we see in the presentation, is that's not necessarily the starting point of the Quebec government's fight against poverty or the other provincial fights against poverty. These human rights that we're talking about, and if you followed other series in this, other conferences in this series of lectures, other people have talked that these human rights are recognized by different governments, are recognized by governments who sign human rights treaties. They're consecrated in these treaties. And it's precisely the way in which our governments are today fighting poverty that the human rights approach is shunted aside. It's not, we don't take into account human rights. We're using another logic. And the logic that's being used by governments as they fight poverty today is the balanced budget logic. I know, am I supposed to be looking at the camera? Probably. So the political context that Canadian provinces have as they fight poverty is this neoliberal balanced budget approach to government and to governing. So I'm looking at the use of indicators in the fight against poverty. Let's take 1 second to take a look at what an indicator is. An indicator is a measuring tool. Okay? An indicator is a figure, it's an index, it's a percentage, it's a statistic that's useful to the extent that it makes possible to monitor the evolution of a situation over time. And as Professor McNaughton mentioned in an earlier talk in this series, indicators have become an important tool for doing impact assessments, notably the environmental impact assessments and the social impact assessments. And according to an emerging literature, if indicators were applied to the field of human rights, they could be used to measure and or evaluate the success or failure of different institutions and actors charged with ensuring human rights compliance. That's kind of where the literature and where the present way of approaching the fight to poverty, well, that's their starting point. As of December 2011, there are 6 Canadian provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba, who have adopted formal, comprehensive, mostly legislated anti-poverty strategies. And each of these 6 strategies are predicated upon the use of indicators to measure and to trace the efficiency of the various measures taken to fight poverty. And what's fascinating is that each of these strategies emerge within the same period of time, same 6 or 7 years, during which the provinces were adjusting to the Canada Social Transfer, which was adopted in 2004. And the Canada Social Transfer is a new federal funding formula which dramatically alters the way in which social programs are administered and provided in Canada. So whereas the post-war Keynesian welfare state, with its various methods of redistributing wealth, was the way in which governments elaborated the social state during the 1960s and 1970s, the present series of provincial anti-poverty strategies arrive in that period of history where the social state is being dismantled. So we're fighting poverty in a context in which governments are withdrawing and retreating from direct social service program and service providal. So provincial anti-poverty strategies arrive during a period of neoliberal consolidation. More precisely, they have materialized just as the state is limiting, if not eliminating completely, its direct role in social program and service delivery. And the changed nature of state intervention in the social sphere, coupled with reduced taxation and the offloading of state responsibilities to new social partners, philanthropic organizations, for-profit private organizations, not-for-profit private organizations, because the communautaire is not-for-private. We're the nice private, because we're not-for-profit, but we are private. And this offloading of responsibilities from the state to these new actors has a direct effect on the nature of these programs and strategies. The other thing is that the provincial anti-poverty strategies are arriving on the scene at a time that we're moving into new public management. And what is new public management? New public management is a form of public administration which is appropriate for the managing of the neoliberal state. At its core and at a first level, new public management is the concept of expert-directed management. Experts who are sometimes public servants, often and increasingly outside resources, develop and use models to understand the world in Paulo Freire's sense of the world, to understand reality. Increasingly, social models are being used in the formulation of public policy. These models provide the necessary framework for identifying social problems and for proposing solutions. And we can just think of pathological gambling, we can think of obesity, we can think of adolescent pregnancies, and we can think of the fight against poverty, as I'm going to show you in a couple of seconds. So first level, expert-directed management. Second level, new public management, is a results-based performance management. The models that we just mentioned provide the basis for action plans that set objectives, targets to be attained, deadlines to be met, and results to be evaluated. I'm doing this really quickly, right? But you're university students, you understand these concepts. Finally, at a third level, new public management is management for dummies, right? Wherein the manager's responsibility is limited to obtaining the desired results. Under new public management, the public servant manager is no longer a source of expertise. Our public service, otherwise it used to be a deposit of expertise, public service is no longer in the same way a deposit of expertise. It's a deposit of managers they're technicians, right? So curiously enough, the public servant manager no longer even needs expertise in the area being managed. I often work with the Ministry of Education, and the public servants that I work with at the Ministry of Education had just been shipped in from the Ministry of Transport, and they were expected to react in education, but you no longer need to have an expertise in the area. What you need to have is an expertise to deliver results. You're expert managers. Now, if constructed on reliable and objective data, models can be interesting tools providing a valid and useful insight into reality. However, the danger is they overstep their legitimate bounds, and rather than interpreting reality, models create reality. Reality is deemed to be what the models describe it to be. And this is what I suggest is what's happening in the fight against poverty. In the field of poverty, public policy is being fashioned by social modeling. Both within and outside of government, poverty has become a really hot research topic. Inspired by the new public management model, indicators are being developed to follow more precisely the evolution of poverty. Under NPM, poverty has become an object of study. It's not an existential crisis. It's an object of study. Indeed, in each of the 6 provincial government anti-poverty strategies, developing models to measure poverty and the behavior of poor people assumes a central place. In New Brunswick, a public call for tender was issued in the summer of 2010 with a clear objective to develop adequate indicators for the measurement of New Brunswick poverty. Manitoba's Poverty Reduction Act legislates the measurement of its anti-poverty strategies progress. In Ontario, the use and type of indicators are also legislated, requiring indicators, and I quote, to measure the success of the strategy that are linked to the determinants of poverty, including but not limited to income, education, health, housing, and the standard of living. And Quebec, which is the mother of all anti-poverty initiatives in Canada, has this act to combat poverty and social exclusion. And the objective of the act, in Article 4, is to make Quebec, by 2013, one of the industrialized nations having the fewest poor people, according to internationally recognized methods of making comparisons. The idea is not to have fewer poor people. It's to have fewer poor people determined by indicators. The Act created a center for le Centre d'études et de recherche, le Centre d'études sur la pauvreté et l'exclusion, which prepared a report in 2007, 2008. And in that report, there are 75 different indicators for scientifically measuring poverty. The use of measurement and indicators gives a scientific veneer to the results-based approach to fighting poverty because these tools are characterized as objective and neutral. They are reputed to be detached, non-emotive tools for policy elaboration. The Quebec government even vaunts its approach to fighting poverty as being founded upon a solid scientific base. And while the debate on the best indicators for measuring poverty, I'll come back next week and do a session on the market basket measure. Is that a good measure for measuring poverty? In other words, it's a question for another session. It's important to note that the choice of which indicators to be used is eminently political. Since the preferred indicators will be used as reference points for measuring the success of different government strategies, it stands to reason that the choice of one set of indicators over another will have political consequences. Similarly, it's really politically important to maintain control over the definition of the preferred measure and its application. And this is such a sensitive issue that several provinces claim that the measures developed by the highly respected Statistics Canada ignore or distort regional particularities. So to complement their anti-poverty strategies, both Quebec and Newfoundland have chosen to invest time, energy, and resources not into fighting poverty, but into measuring poverty. And they've set up regional variants. They've set up institutions to develop regional variants to more accurately measure the progress of their anti-poverty strategies. In other words, they contest the data provided by Statistics Canada, and they set up their own institutions for developing their own data. As mentioned, the call for tender issued by the New Brunswick government is to develop adequate indicators for measuring New Brunswick poverty. Therefore, New Brunswick poverty is going to be fighting with women's poverty and seniors' poverty and Indigenous peoples' poverty to find its poverty space. And having accurate provincial data is absolutely essential when one of the measurement outcomes by which anti-poverty strategies are to be judged is the comparative. Indeed, these provincial strategies are akin to childish competitive arguments about who has won a contest. Rather than being designed in order to ensure that the beneficiaries of these strategies are those who have been living in poverty, the purpose of the measurement seems to be allow one government to say to others, "We are better than you." And from the point of view of a poor person, the person in Quebec is royally uninterested whether he is more or less poor or his rights are more or less violated than the New Brunswick poor person, right? The urge to measure has dramatically transformed. Now I think maybe it will get interesting and maybe a little bit more concrete. Has dramatically transformed how poverty is conceptualized. In the neoliberal policy universe, poverty has become principally a statistical reality, a phenomenon to be measured and compared. Depending upon the measure chosen, a person is poor or not poor. Poverty becomes an object to be debated amongst those experts, those very experts, who are producing different methods for measuring poverty. Indeed, we can even talk about the creation of a new poverty industry, which has sprung up around the new poverty experts. And I make a distinction between the new poverty industry and the traditional poverty industry of the Saint Vincent de Paul and the Salvation Army and soup kitchens. That's the old poverty industry. The new poverty industry are the experts who are generating all of these indicators. It becomes a contest to see who has the best and the most accurate indicator. The poor become dispossessed of their own reality, and their voices are not heard because they aren't important. The poor people aren't the experts. The experts are the experts on poor people. In terms of public policy, the poor person is the person deemed poor by the choice of indicator. Change the indicator, and you change the poor person. That's what these 75 different scientific measures are all about. Change the indicator, and you physically change who is considered poor. Poor people are reduced to statistics on a page, part of an aggregate, forming a trend. And further, when poverty policy decisions are based upon poverty measurement criteria, another dislocation occurs. As policy becomes directed to meeting state-identified needs, a hierarchy is established. Certain needs are deemed to be more important than others. Limited resources will be targeted to redress the most urgent needs. The fight against poverty thus becomes the fight to meet targets. It has little to do with moving poor people out of their situation of poverty. And to quote the minister responsible for the Newfoundland and Labrador poverty reduction strategy, I am proud to report that indicators point to a significant improvement in the fight against poverty in our province. Well, if the indicators say it, it must be true. Now, I'm not proposing a full and direct attack on the use of indicators as a way of illustrating reality. They can, and they do, provide and play a useful role. However, specifically in the field of human rights, and specifically in the fight against poverty, using indicators as the principal measurement tool for evaluating the success or failure of measures has serious limitations. It's my hypothesis that I put to you today. For example, human rights violations are often identified by storytelling. That is, by using a narrative framework, which is quite different from the framework provided by social modeling. A narrative framework is rooted in a profound respect of the victim's story. That is, of how the victim understands their world. In other words, while a social model represents one way of understanding the world, storytelling offers a different representation. And in a human rights context, the importance of the narrative framework may be seen in its extensive use by the legal profession when lawyers have their clients testify to plead their case. Testimonies are nothing if not a form of storytelling. And while indicators streamline and systematize a field of inquiry, they also serve to limit it. If properly used, indicators can indeed provide a focal point, and offer a dynamic understanding of reality that is situated in space and time. However, they can't claim to provide an understanding of what is situated outside of their focus. Stories, on the other hand, while potentially less focused, and some would say less objective, permit the creation of greater linkages around different realities. Stories allow different realities to be confronted because there are always different stories. Mine and yours and his and hers. And as the debate concerning the use of indicators in the field of human rights grow, two significant shifts of the past 20 years need to be noted. One is linguistic, the other is paradigmatic. Whereas the universalism implicit in a human rights approach influenced social planning and public policy during the 1960s and the 1970s, social stakeholders and public office holders are currently turning to a clientelist approach, client approach. Guided by the neoliberal principles of new public management, policymakers, social planners, and community partners literally lap up any mention of measures, indicators, and targets. They preach reaching results and evaluations. Attaining some form of universal public good is no longer the basis for state action and figures less and less at the heart of the social movement's platform. If you've understood me, it's a criticism of the milieu in which I'm coming from, because I see it in my own milieu. Increasingly, we're pushing for social housing for women. We're pushing for social housing for young people. The idea of pushing for social housing for everybody is off the map politically, because programs are set up to target specific populations. Attaining some form of universal public good, therefore, is no longer the basis for state action and figures less and less at the heart of the social movement's platform. What is valued is the particular, not the universal, the need, not the right, the client, not the citizen. Human rights violations are experiential, even existential in nature. For the person whose rights are being violated, there are consequences. The fridge is empty. The dwelling is in a sorry state. A parent's child is rejected by other children at school because he or she is not wearing brand name clothing. And as long as a person's rights are violated, that person is prevented from attaining the fullness of life guaranteed by such fundamental documents as the International Declaration of Human Rights. Moreover, although an empirical fact or a set of empirical facts, a human rights violation is also a political and a legal fact that demands a remedy. Social management by problems and result indicators belies this affirmation. While social management might address certain human needs, it does not propose any remedies to the rights violations involved. Indeed, in many cases, social management does not even take human rights into account. While human rights are universal and often require immediate satisfaction, when these rights are transformed into a needs discourse, they are submitted to a number of negotiations and transactions, and in the process, they lose their universal, indivisible, and enforceable nature. The paradigm shift that I'm describing is taking place at the same time, I repeat, as the state is withdrawing from its direct intervention in the social field. By putting an end to universal services and programs, governments are retreating to the point where they are limiting their intervention to meeting the needs of the most vulnerable and the most needy groups in society. To properly define its reduced role, the state turns to the social modeling approach. And in this universe, the indicators are tools that facilitate a ranking process. Up here, I'm almost finished. To a ranking process, right, leading inevitably to exclusion for some. For although rights may be deemed universal, needs can be ranked on a scale, with some being judged essential and others less so. In a context where we are dealing with a scarcity of resources or lack of political will, one particular need ends up being more important than another. And beyond the concept of model building, the fundamental goal of the entire neoliberal procedure, we really must be taken into consideration. And I thank the Minister of Finance, the Federal Minister of Finance, Flaherty, for having said in a most remarkable and incredible thing, any job is a good job. We're dealing with human rights here. Any job is a good job. I would say any job that pays a decent wage, any job which provides a healthy work environment is a good job. But any job is not a good job. We need to have human rights considerations. Neoliberalism and each of the provincial anti-poverty strategies revolves around getting poor people into the paid labor force. That's what they're all about. Peu importe comment qu'ils s'y retrouvent, l'idée, c'est de se trouver un emploi. Thanks an awful lot. You've been very